Hey, real quick before we start the podcast, if you have listened to more than one episode, can you do me a favor and rate and review the show? Now, I'm not big on asking for favors, but we really want to get this podcast listed in the top of all health and fitness podcasts, not just the fitness category. This will take you less than a minute, and if you could do that, that would make us friends forever. And since we refuse all sponsors on the show, this will be my only ask rather than telling you to go check out some supplement or product we don't actually believe in, like every other podcast out there. So please rate and review. Okay, that's it. To the podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Garage Gym Athlete Podcast. I'm Jerred Moon, and today I'm going to be doing a quick book review of the book Outlive by Dr. Peter Attias. So the official title is Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity. And it is by Peter Attias and with Bill Gifford. It's Rethinking Medicine to Live Better Longer. This is a very thick book. I have the audiobook. I also have a physical copy. And I'm not going to be covering the whole book. It's just too long to be covering every single thing. But what I was most interested in when I got it is obviously the fitness sections. The book is broken down into 3 parts. Part 1 is just an introduction to this medicine 3.0 that he's talking about, which is more about prevention than how we are now, in medicine 2.0, which is more of a reaction. Part 2, he just talks a lot about the most common killers, cancer, heart disease, all those kind of things. And then part 3, he really gets into exercising, training, nutrition, those kind of things. And I'm specifically going to be hitting on chapters 11, chapter 12, and chapter 13, where he does break down his opinion of how we should train. So that's where I'm going to be reviewing, really just because my expertise as someone who's been in the fitness industry and a coach for a long time, I have opinions about what he's put out. So let's dive into it. So overall, Peter Attias is training for what he calls the centenarian decathlon, or things he wants himself and his patients to be able to do by the age of 100 plus. And in the book, he lists like 10 different events that range from opening a jar to hiking 1.5 miles on a hilly trail. He goes on to say that there are actually 50 or more items on this list. He doesn't reveal all of them. I don't think he's trying to hide anything. He just doesn't reveal all of them, I think, because it would make for boring reading. But then he does reference about 10 more that are on his personal list that have more to do with like his specific goals of like swimming a certain distance over in a certain time, all those kind of things. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that Peter is really just training to have the longest health span as possible. He wants to be able to do at 100 what he can now do in his 50s, and he's not suggesting a fitness protocol for the best possible performance. And so I'm not trying to critique anything like that. You always have to know what someone's training for. If you're training just to be a generally healthy person, you could walk and do some push-ups. But if we're getting into performance, it just gets a little bit different. But he is looking for a fitness protocol that will keep you able-bodied for the rest of your life. So what is the fitness protocol? That's really what I want to dive into next. And to get this done, he is ultimately focused on 3 areas. And so I was really trying to get into his system, his ideas behind this. They're heavily influenced by 3 different people, 3 specific people, which I found interesting because as someone who's been in the industry, who reads a lot of research, pays attention to what's going on in the industry, that's a critique I have right off the bat is I know he's looked at a lot of research, but the 3 people seem to be Dr. Andy Galpin, which I have a lot of respect for. Interviewed him on the Better Humanology podcast. Very knowledgeable person. You can listen to a lot of different podcasts that he's done. He did a great series with Andrew Huberman. It was like a 6-part series on training and all these kind of stuff. So something that you should definitely check out if you really like to deep dive into these things. So that was one person. Another person is, I had never heard of her before. He mentioned it. It's really just his personal trainer, Beth Lewis. He mentions her name a lot in this book. So specifically got a lot of information from Beth Lewis, who I have no doubt is a great trainer, but I have not heard of her before this book. And then the other person is, I may mispronounce it, Igno San Milan. who's done some incredible research with high-performance athletes, and I even referenced some of his studies in my book, Killing Comfort, that was published in March of 2020. I started writing in 2018, so I've been familiar with his work for a very long time. So those are his three sources, and then obviously he's looking at a lot of literature and research, which, again, my only critique is hopefully there are more. It sounds like Peter's been into fitness for a very long time, but I just think that's a lot to pull for, hey, this is how you should best train for the rest of your life, predominantly coming from three people. And no doubt those are three pretty legit humans. Like I said, I don't know much about Beth Lewis, but ultimately 2 out of the 3 I know and have a lot of respect for. So what is his framework? He focuses on 3 different areas: aerobic endurance or efficiency, strength, and stability. So those are the all-encompassing areas. Those are his pillars right there for being able to live the longest life possible. And so let's get into those a little bit more and what he's talking about with these. So specifically for aerobic endurance or efficiency, he really hammers home the point of zone 2 work, and that's Milan's work and what he's a big proponent of. And I agree with him here. Like, you have to get in a lot of zone 2 work, and I also disagree with some of his prescription, and I'll talk about why a little bit later on in the podcast. But zone 2 work is huge. So if you're not familiar with what zone 2 work is, then you probably are listening to this podcast for the first time, because we've been talking about zone 2 for years. So zone 2 is really, he gets into a very technical definition of it, how you can test your blood to be able to see how much lactate is in there, all that stuff. I don't think that's necessary. Typically we say like a conversational pace, 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. There are a lot of different ways to do it, but ultimately you want to avoid muscle burn, be at a low heart rate. And my stance on this is leaning more towards the MAF zone. So Phil Maffetone, you've probably heard me talk about him as well, which is typically around 180 minus your age. That's the zone 2 that I'm shooting for most of the time, and I found most effective with myself and with athletes. So zone 2 work, why does he think that you should focus on it? Really, it's overall, it builds healthy mitochondria. And so the healthier your mitochondria, the faster it can metabolize energy, make energy, process a lot of different processes in your body. I'm no expert on mitochondria, not even trying to pretend to be, but I do know where zone 2 fits in for increasing your aerobic base, which can increase your overall fitness. Now, the second part of his aerobic endurance / efficiency is VO2 max work. So he went into some detail about focusing on this top end. One of the workouts he recommended were like 4 minutes on, all out, 4 minutes off. So a simple 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, really going for that top end, which again, I have some issues with, and I'll talk about in a minute. But ultimately, that's what he's saying, aerobic endurance and efficiency. Overall, I have no real problems with like what he's talking about. These are like great things. I'm going to get into the weeds as a fitness coach and someone who's been obsessed with programming for a very long time on some of these things. So zone 2 work, VO2 max work. So really just base and then top end is what he's saying that you should focus on. And there's a lot of research behind it. Now, when we get into the strength section of the book, I feel like it was actually a little bit unorganized with how he went through it, because out of nowhere, there's this like really long section on rucking. And I couldn't tell if this is part of his protocol or not. But I agree with, if you've been around, again, Garage Gym Athlete, I agree with carrying heavy loads for long distances, love rucking, all that stuff. But there was a good amount about there in rucking in his strength category, but I couldn't tell specifically if this is considered part of his strength work or zone 2 work or whatever. So rucking is part of his strength protocol, or at least in this section of his book. Grip strength is very big, is something he talks a lot about. And there's a lot of research on grip strength being associated with being longevity. Let's just call longevity, and hence why he put it in here. So a lot of focus on grip strength. And then he talks about concentric and eccentric loading, pulling motions, and hip hinging motions. So if I had to just break this down, he's saying lift weights, because that's concentric, eccentric, it's pulling motions, it's hip hinging movements, just lift weights, probably with a barbell, focus on grip strength, and then rucking. Great. It's a great strength protocol. I'll get into some of my critiques of that as well. And then we get into his third and final pillar, which is stability. He talks about dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, which, to be honest, most people don't train that way. It's actually more utilized in rehab settings, and I'm not saying it needs to be, but he talks about DNS, which I think is great. The research on that is awesome, really cool. A lot of people aren't going to utilize it, to be honest, unless you're just like really into fitness. I do think that goes beyond the scope of most people. In stability, he also talks about breath work, proper bracing, those kind of things, also very important. And then it was a pretty long chapter on stability. I'm just going to sum it up as paying attention to movement patterns. He does put stability like in its own way, but like we could just say stability is mobility, it's breath work, it's paying attention to your movement patterns and making sure they're perfect, and DNS and all this kind of stuff. So that's his stability category. Again, I don't have any real issues with any of this stuff. But where things start to get confusing for me, his prescription, when we get down to the prescription, because he didn't give an actual prescription, he just mentions in a one-off sentence here or there what you should be doing. So his prescription of aerobic endurance, efficiency, strength, and stability is where it does get a little bit confusing because his prescription is vague. So at times in the book, he will only tell you what he specifically does on a weekly basis. Like, I do this specific thing 4 times per week for an hour a day or whatever. Other times he will reference the minimum effective dose. So like when he's talking about rucking, he's like, I ruck 4 times a week for an hour. And then when he talks about the minimum effective dose for Zone 2, he mentions both. He's like, I do this 4 different times a week for an hour. And then also the minimum amount you need to be able to do is 4 45-minute sessions, 3 hours per week. So he can give you a range. So I scoured the book because if I'm going to be talking about someone else's work, I really want to like, hey, what exactly did they say? And so I scoured the book to see what a training week looks like. And here's what I found. So Zone 2 work, he's suggesting a minimum. Like they were saying that this is like the minimum amount that you can even see a result is 3 hours per week of Zone 2 work. And that's coming from some like heavy hitter like Igno San Milan. Like he knows better than me, but for that to be a minimum already, and we haven't even thrown anything else in there, this is going to be a hefty prescription. And Peter says he does 4 hours per week. So for the VO2 max work, it said a minimum of 1 hour per week, but up to 2 hours per week. So he said for some people, you can get away with just doing 1 hour session per week, but you could go up to doing 2 VO2 max sessions per week. So doing these sprints or these all out 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off twice per week. Now, traditional strength training, he doesn't specifically say in the book, and I read through it twice just to make sure he didn't mention how long he does it. But my guess with how traditional of a split he was suggesting is going to be 3 to 5 hours per week. Really probably the 5 hours per week, if not more. Because he was very pro strength training, as you should be, just talking about how strength and muscle mass are so important as you age. So we're talking 3 to 5 hours per week minimum for strength training. Now, rucking is where he specifically said he devotes 4 hours per week to. He does it 4 different times a week for 1 hour each. Stability is 2 dedicated hours per week, so 2 different days have an hour, and then 15 minutes every other day, so roughly 3 hours total per week. And don't worry, I'll get to like why I'm going through all this. So on the low end of his prescription in the book, we're talking about 14 hours of training per week. That's on the low end. That's if I'm taking all the minimum effective doses he's talking about, we're talking about 14 hours per week. And then on the high end, we're talking about 18 hours per week. So let's just assume that you're on a 6-day training schedule with 1 day off. That's 2.33 hours to 3 hours per day dedicated to fitness. And that is where I start to have a little bit of an issue because I just don't buy it. Like the people who have lived to be 100 probably didn't start in their 30s dedicating 3 hours per day to fitness for the rest of their lives. And because there are all these examples of people 100 plus who've done all these amazing things. He mentions them in their book, and I still don't think that they were doing 3 hours per day dedicated to fitness, but who knows? Maybe Peter's prescription will help you live to 150, and all these people who just made it to 104 or 105 are just scratching the surface of what's possible. But my biggest issue with it, I have no problem with training. I love training. I probably could do more of it. Like I would love to do more than I already do. But when we're talking about actually helping people, like actually being useful, it's hard to get human beings right now to commit to 3 to 4 hours per week. So 14 to 18 is a stretch. And that's where I was wondering when I read this section of the book, is this book supposed to be something for the masses? And that was my assumption because he was with all the big names. Peter Attias has like a great social network. Like he's been on all the big podcasts, like Oprah plugged his book, like all sorts of stuff. So you're thinking the masses, right? But when you get into the fitness protocol, asking someone to train 14 to 18 hours per week is a little bit crazy, because most Americans won't do 3 to 4, and it's hard to get them to do that. So 14 to 18 is hard. So 14 to 18 is out of the question. And so that was my biggest critique, and I have some suggestions on how we can make this more efficient. But my biggest critique was, is this more like a book for someone who is into longevity, meaning that's your hobby? My hobby is I'm going to try and live as long as possible, because that sounds like that's what Peter's hobby is. I mean, he like drives race cars and like shoots a bow and other stuff, but I think his biggest hobby is probably trying to live as long as he possibly can. And I just think I don't know who the book is for anymore when I see that, because we have some sick, awesome athletes at Garage Gym Athlete who are going to, barring any crazy accidents or whatever, are going to live much longer than people who are not training right now. And they're putting in 4 to 5 hours per week, and they're doing awesome things. So where does this 18 hours come in? And I think the real problem is I feel like Peter had gotten a little too compartmentalized in each one of these areas, how to get better and how to improve. And so that's what I want to talk about. So he's got a great framework. It's backed by a lot of research, but it's being implemented in a very inefficient way is ultimately what I'm trying to say. So how can we make it better? How can we get all the benefit Peter Attia has highlighted, but not spend 18 hours per week in the gym, which no one's going to do? You're getting to like professional athlete status, probably the lower end of professional athlete status at 18 hours per week. And I will say this, all of that 14 to 18 hour time frame was just stuff I pulled straight from the book. I did read some other blog posts in preparation for recording this podcast, and I stumbled across one article where someone had talked about an episode that Peter Attia had recorded where he broke down how he fits all this into his week. And I didn't listen to the episode, but I read this blog post that someone else had written, and it looked like Peter trained, how he said he fit it all in was he trains 7 days per week, and of the 7 days per week, he's doing about an hour and a half per day. It came out to being about 9+ hours per week in the gym. That's more doable, still beyond what most people are going to do, but it's more doable. So I do think there's some miscommunication between what he's maybe implementing and what he's actually doing. Because to say, hey, I go ruck 4 times per week for an hour. Oh, and I also do separate zone 2 work on my bike 4 times a week for an hour. We're already at 8 hours. We haven't even done strength training or stability work. So I do think there may have been some miscommunication. And I think that's important. And the reason I'm harping on it is because people already feel bad enough that they're not exercising or exercising enough. And then to say, hey, to truly be a healthy human being and live longer, this is the minimum. Like, it's just crazy. So how do we get it better? First, if I were to take his system and change it, if Peter Attia cared what I thought, I would take his aerobic endurance and efficiency category, and I would simply change that to energy systems. And if you've been in our training for a while, I just look at things a little bit differently. I look at things a little bit differently. I look at everything as an energy system. So there's the phosphagen system, creatine phosphate system. It's the 10 seconds or less. This is the one that he ignores. He doesn't really talk about it. He really only truly talks about the oxidative system. The glycolytic system is when you're getting past that 10 seconds and you're going up to 2-3 minutes, something like that. All out effort. Glycolytic is the worst. And then oxidative is when you get above that 2 minutes, above those 3 minutes, and then all of that is going to be considered your oxidative system. Now, all of these energy systems can operate at the same time in different capacities, all that kind of stuff. That's always the caveat when you're talking about energy system training. There's never just one system. But he really only focuses on that oxidative system because even in his prescription, if you look at energy systems, when you're doing one-to-one work to rest, meaning if I work for 2 minutes, I rest for 2 minutes, that is by definition, energy system. That is an oxidative interval he's thrown out there. It's not glycolytic or the phosphagen system. And I think that there's a lot of benefit in focusing on all 3 different energy systems because you can work on being explosive and powerful in 10 seconds or less, whether that's a lift, an explosive lift, a jump, a very short sprint. And then the glycolytic system, I've even admittedly said that you can ignore this system unless you're seeking performance, unless you really want to, performance is your goal. Because I do think that you can live a long, healthy, happy life if you just focus on the phosphagen system and the oxidative system with ignoring the glycolytic. But if you want performance in any capacity, you want to hit glycolytic every once in a while. I don't think that you have to do it every single week. And I'd argue that some of his prescriptions for like his 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, you're getting a lot closer to glycolytic. A lot of the research and stuff on energy systems, it says that glycolytic kind of caps out at 2 minutes, but I've always pushed back on that and said I don't think that's true. I feel like glycolytic can probably go a little bit longer than that, but how much longer, I don't know. So I feel like you're probably glycolytic for, let's just say it was a hard cutoff at 2 minutes. You're glycolytic for the first 2 minutes before you start to train the oxidative system, the last 2 minutes of that workout that he suggests. And then the rest times it would be the only problem because you want to be fully recovered. And he even says that in his book that you should be fully recovered before you go to the next bout. But when you limit it to 4 minutes recovery time when you're doing 4 minutes all out, that's not really going to work. So anyway, I just think that he should take a broader approach to aerobic endurance and efficiency, because if you just look at it as energy systems, you can still do all of those same things. You can still do your VO2 max work. You can still do all your zone 2 work, and you can work the other energy systems to be even a more well-rounded human being. Now, will this translate into more longevity? I don't know. I'm going to say yes. If he thinks the VO2 max system is so important for overall longevity, then I think that we should throw in a little bit more glycolytic work. Okay, and then another thing that I wanted to hit on was when you are doing energy system training, like he's suggesting, I think one thing that's is overlooked and a lot of people don't understand is that energy system work, whether that's VO2 max work, when you're doing these shorter intervals, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, if you are not strong, you cannot benefit as much from the training. It's a prerequisite to being good at this type of training. Because if I take a new trainee and I'm like, hey, we're going to do some VO2 max work today, it's going to be 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, they can't even really go in the pain cave because if they don't have a solid strength base. So you can't really work on VO2 max work as much if there's not a strength base. So you have to be able to do that. And luckily, he talks a lot about strength and how important it is. But I want anyone listening to this to know that to truly benefit from harder level conditioning, you have to build up your strength at the same time. Which leads me into his strength protocol. Now, I think that his strength is pretty good. I do think it's a bit oddly broken down, since any good strength program is going to require concentric and eccentric loading. He does talk a little bit more about being very mindful of an eccentric load, so like the lowering off a box, like coming down for 3 seconds on a box step down. So if you're stepping down off a box, like being able to lower yourself. I think those things are very important too, but I've never seen them so focused before. So I think that you could easily, like at Garage Gym Athlete, we do tempo training all the time. That's focusing on concentric, eccentric, and even isometric, which he completely left out. So other things that he focused on, pulling motion, hip hinging motions, and grip strength. I don't think that there's any need to break those down individually. I think that if you're just doing compound movements with a barbell or kettlebell, you're going to be doing pulling motions, hip hinging motions, and grip strength. And then he does talk about rucking in his strength section of his book. And we could put that in the strength category, but for me, I would prefer to put that in a conditioning modality in the oxidative system that will act as zone 2 work. So that was another one of my critiques, is like he put rucking in his strength, and I get it. So every step you take, it's unilateral load. There's stability involved, engaging the core. I get it. But ultimately, if Peter's actually going and doing zone 2 work 4 times per week for an hour, and then separately doing rucking 4 times a week for an hour, and then also doing zone 2 work 4 different times for an hour, why can't those be the same thing? Why can't your rucking just be your zone 2 work? And so it obviously can. It can. That's the answer. You don't have to sit on a bike and be at a certain wattage for a certain amount of time to be truly in zone 2. And this is where I think zone 2 is just getting out of hand. Because when we were talking about this originally years ago, it was a fringe thing. A lot of people didn't know about it. Like some elite triathletes knew that you needed to train in lower zones. And now it's like all the runners are talking about it. Oh, you got to run slower if you want to run faster. And everyone's talking about zone 2, mitochondrial health, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, can we just talk about it's heart rate training? If I'm doing strength training in a garage and it's hot, I'm going to be in zone 2 that whole time. Say I do an hour, 15 minutes of strength training and I trained strength. Okay, I'm getting stronger. I did all the stuff to get stronger, but my heart rate stayed in the zone 2 for 75 minutes, zone 2 range for 75 minutes because of 1, the heat, and 2, I'm lifting weights, I'm not resting as much. Why can't that count as both? And this is where I was saying I think Peter Attia got too compartmentalized. And I feel like a lot of people have in the industry. Things can be concurrent. I'm not a huge fan of CrossFit training, just the high intensity all the time. You can look at CrossFitters and see what they've done. They have this mixed modality way of training where everything is mixed modality. And you can have a mixed modality that's aerobic training. You can have mixed modality that's strength training. You can have mixed modality that's anaerobic, glycolytic. If you program these things correctly with proper work to rest ratios and all that kind of stuff, and then you get into the proper reps and sets and weights, you could do one singular mixed modality workout. We just did this in our last cycle, Garage Gym Athlete, where we were doing 40-minute EMOMs. That's strength training. That's aerobic conditioning, probably zone 2 for a lot of people. And it can even act as stability if it's programmed appropriately. While I understand all these different categories, yeah, we got stability, we got strength, we got aerobic efficiency. Like, you could really knock all of these things out in one training session. And that's where I think you get a lot more efficient. And so for his strength, I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with his suggestion. I obviously like to see a little bit more emphasis on submax effort and dynamic effort methods. I think if we're talking about longevity, you could probably leave out max effort method if you truly wanted to. But when you're talking about that, the fact that strength and muscle mass are the most important for longevity, you need to be doing all the things that he says, but then there has to be a conversation about rep schemes and weights and all those kind of things, because there are specific reps and sets and intensities that will get you stronger. There are sets, reps, and intensities that will help you gain more muscle mass. And so how do we program these things specifically and not just go do strength training that has hip hinging, pulling, all that kind of stuff, concentric and eccentric loading? So I think that we could have gotten more in the programming. He could have gotten more in the programming for strength and talked specifically about sets, reps, and intensities for accomplishing 1, more strength, and 2, hypertrophy, more muscle mass. So that was my only other critique there. Lastly, stability. Now, I don't disagree with his ideas of what he's calling stability at all. However, I feel there's an overemphasis here due to, I don't know, maybe the light bulb moment he had in working with Beth Lewis specifically, maybe his own injury history. Because to me, a lot of the items he mentions in his stability pillar are really just simple training principles, like emphasis on breath, good movement patterns. And while all of that's valuable, I'm not negating any of it. I feel like his stability chapter was longer than aerobic endurance, efficiency, and strength. And most people aren't going to go DNS, go do DNS. Like they're just not. And so I don't have a huge problem with it. But again, I don't know who the book was for. It's a book for someone like me who's super into training, and hell, I'll do 18 hours a week in a training week if I really want to. Like, cool, I'm down for that. But if we're talking about how do we help average people get better at training, they're not doing DNS. They're not training 14 hours per week. They're not going to focus on zone 2. So how can we just make it more approachable for the average person? And so I could be missing here on who the book was written for. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Overall, I think the book was pretty good. I was a huge stickler here getting into the fitness sections, really just because I've been doing this stuff for such a long time, and I have my own ideas. I think we're in agreement that ultimately concurrent training is the best way to train. That's my biggest takeaway from him, where we just completely agree. Concurrent training is it. Like, you need to be doing strength training. You need to be doing some sort of monostructural conditioning, whether that's running, cycling, or if you like to do mixed modality stuff, something like that. And so ultimately we're in agreement. I just feel like he could probably make it a little bit more approachable and then realize that you don't have to compartmentalize these things as much and still see a lot of results. I think ultimately that's what we've learned in Garage Gym Athlete and programming for the last decade, is that people can see phenomenal results by hitting all the different areas that we need to hit, doing all the different energy systems, training all the different strength methods, throwing in the correct amount of zone 2 instability, mobility, all those kind of things, breath work, and still only hit 4 to 5 hours per week. And you can still see amazing results in doing so. So ultimately, that's what I wanted people to know, is there's what you can do, and then there's efficient training means that you are not wasting time just doing lots of stuff. That's been how I feel about influencers or professional athletes or something. Like, somebody will look at their body and be like, that's amazing, I'll never achieve that. They might be putting 3 to 4 hours a day in the gym. So why would you even have that expectation? Like why would you think that you can do that if you're only training 45 minutes a day, 4 times per week? And now we're hitting it on this side, even with longevity, is I think that if I listened to this and added it all up, I would be discouraged. I'd be like, crap, I better start like doing an hour and a half in the morning, an hour and a half in the evening. And like for most people, it's just not realistic. So ultimately, I don't want to come off as someone who didn't like the book. I think it's a great book. Definitely grab a copy, read it, and let me know what you think of the fitness section and if it can be improved, or maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? I'm always open to that as well. But that's it for this one. If you are part of the Garage Gym Athlete community, I really appreciate you sticking around, doing the training, and being a part of the community. And if you want to see what really efficient training looks like, you can go to garagegymathlete.com, where we're not just putting average, random, inefficient workouts on there. We actually have very efficient, research, science-backed workouts that could get you really fit without having to train 14 to 18 hours per week. So go to garagegymathlete.com, sign up for a free trial, and we'd love to have you. That's it for this one. Remember, if you don't kill, comfort will kill you. To the Garage Gym Athlete podcast. If you want to learn more, go to garagegymathlete.com. You can learn about our training. Let us send you a copy of our book, The Garage Gym Athlete, or you can even get featured on the Garage Gym Athlete podcast. Thanks for listening.